Hello, everybody. So today you should have started The Mushroom at the End of the World on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins by Agnes Scott. This is an ethnography of Matsuaki harvesting. And one of the things I really love about this book is the way Agnes Scott is engaged with this work of imagining life within ruins, or the possibilities of life within ruins, that really is not about finding a pure space of liberation or salvation. It's very different from this call for abolition, or even a call for communism. It's a very modest practice of thinking about how people exist within spaces of catastrophic ruin wrought by these capitalist world orders. And so essentially, if we're looking at climate change and collapse and ruination as a historical event, not a future one, if we're looking at climate apocalypse as a historical event, then the question, how do people survive? How do people live? How do people make life within these spaces of ruin, these spaces of catastrophe, becomes an ethnographic question. We can actually look and say, how do people already do this? And maybe as we pay attention to how people already make life within spaces of ruin, that will help us understand the political possibilities and the social possibilities afforded within these spaces of slow violence and collapse, these spaces of post-apocalypse. Basically, we're looking at life in ruins as an ethnographic question. So in these first 50 pages, Agnes Scott throws so many concepts at you. And my goal in this PowerPoint in this lecture is to elucidate some of these concepts. To help y'all with your brain, I've organized these concepts into primary versus secondary concepts. The primary concepts articulate Agnes Scott's argument, whereas the secondary concepts deepen that argument but are not necessarily central in the same way. So if you get the primary concepts, you'll get the book. Basically, Agnes Scott is saying, starting with precarity, the idea that the world that we live in is defined by precarity, by vulnerability, by indeterminacy, by instability. And that's the condition. That's not the condition of a few people. It's the condition of the world we live in. It's the condition for everyone. And part of the logic of this precarity, part of what produces this precarity, I mean, Agnes Scott would probably say that precarity is just a necessity of life, but part of those contemporary conditions of precarity are constructed through the ways in which capitalism as a system of social and economic and political organization produces landscapes of ruins. So ruins is not the failure of capitalism. Capitalism is a process of producing ruins. Now, as we live within precarity and ruins, we are forced to find ways of existing in these spaces of contamination. Contamination names the way in which our bodies are not self-contained or discrete, but rather we're always intermixed with one another. And so when we look at Matsuaki mushrooms, we're looking at the ways in which mushrooms, as well as the livelihoods that are made possible by mushroom harvesting, exist within these spaces of precarity and ruins. We're looking at contingent labor, harvesting mushrooms that actually thrive in the ruins of capitalism. The spaces of ruin produced through capitalist processes. And this is about lifeways that are defined by contamination. Mushrooms are not a kind of pure liberatory space prior to capitalism. The ways people harvest them are not a pure, ethically liberated, or ethically pure space. Rather, it's finding ways of existing in contaminated, ruined landscapes. Ways of making life together. And this gets us at the question of scalability and non-scalability. For Agnes Scott, Matsuaki harvesting is non-scalable. You can't mass produce Matsuaki harvesting because the ways in which these mushrooms grow, they can't be cultivated in the same way. They can't be monocropped. And so it produces these spaces of value. These are very valuable mushrooms that are contingent upon capitalism and that they flourish in these spaces of ruination. And yet they also resist assimilation into capitalism in certain ways. And so there's this funny dynamic in which these non-capitalist modes of production end up being integrated into a larger capitalist world system. And that tension is really integral to this book. And that's what Anat Singh is talking about in this tension between scalability and non-scalability. The inability of Matsuzaki mushroom harvesting to be scaled up, even as it becomes possible within the kinds of messes created by these scalable processes of capitalist production. The main arguments of the book can be neatly summarized as follows. This is a research project that looks at life in ruins, how people make life in ruins, as an ethnographic project. It argues that Matsuzaki picking provides us with good insights into the conditions of precarity and ruination as defining conditions of the 21st century global economy and global world order, political ecology, to draw on a word from last class. And the third main argument is that Singh is going to tell us over and over again to focus on heterogeneity and tension and multiplicity and not just a unified march or harmony. And she's going to give us a number of tools, conceptual tools, for thinking with heterogeneity and not tension. One of her arguments in this book, right, is that heterogeneity is a condition of life, even as capitalist production has historically tended to operate by expanding projects of homogenization, for example, monocropping, in order to extract value. The irony that she gets at, right, is that capitalism also requires ways of appropriating heterogeneity into these larger global economic flows. So this is, as I have suggested, an ethnography of life in capitalist ruins. And in the opening pages that you didn't actually read because most of it's acknowledgments, Anat Singh articulates her motivation for this book, what she's really trying to get at. And she writes, "The time has come for new ways of telling stories beyond civilization's first principles. Without man and nature, all creatures can come back to life, and men and women can express themselves without the structures of a parochial imagined rationality." I love this quote, right? Her implication is that these Enlightenment concepts of man, capital M, and nature, and this opposition between man and nature, has created these spaces of ruins and the systematic production of death, the systematic production of ruin. And these concepts of man and nature are tied to this idea, what she calls a parochial imagined rationality, this Enlightenment construction of rationality. And so Anat Singh is trying to get at new ways of telling stories that move beyond these principles of man and nature and rationality. These Enlightenment principles, these principles defining quote-unquote civilization, or what she might more specifically also call capitalism and empire. And so how does an ethnography of how people survive in the ruins of capitalism help us grapple with this question? How do we tell stories beyond these principles of man and nature? These principles, what we called at the beginning of class, these liberal presuppositions, these cultural constructions that organize this system of world burning, for lack of a better word, these systems of environmental catastrophe and white supremacy and empire. And so what this book does is it follows Matsuzaki trails. Basically, she's not looking at one particular place. It's a multi-sided ethnography. She's looking at this complex global economy of Matsuzaki, and sorry for not being able to pronounce that word consistently, harvesting and production. Her research starts in 2014 and goes through 2011, and she's looking at how these complex global production chains span across multiple countries. She's also looking at perspectives from scientists, foresters, and traders. And so her goal here, right, is to really do an ethnography of a supply chain that moves across and connects many different localities. And before I go into the meat of the book, I want to introduce this concept of multi-species ethnography. Because what Singh is doing here is part of this larger shift, part of a larger conceptual shift in anthropology towards this idea of multi-species ethnography. Basically, not just looking at humans or anthropos, but looking at relationships between humans and non-humans. Thinking about non-humans as active social relations, as active participants in society. Looking at how humans and non-humans make life together, because we are always making life together. There is no purely human situation, right? We're always making life with non-animals. I'm sorry, with animals, with plants, with what we might call I would not call, but I am calling apparently inanimate objects. One of the kinds of ideas pushed forward by scholars in this framework of multi-species ethnography is the importance of talking about becoming, not being. The idea, right, being is static, but becoming is a process. And these scholars are arguing that we're always in the process of becoming through our relationships with other humans and non-human beings. Another concept that comes out of this scholarship is questions about animacy and inanimacy, and problematizing that binary. There's a lovely scholar, Stacey Alamo, who writes about animacy and gay sex in non-human animals, and the ways in which quote-unquote gay sex is conceptualized by human communities. Animal gay sex is conceptualized within human communities, whether it's erased within these kinds of assumptions that sex is purely procreative and thus heterosexual, or appropriated by queer movements and labeled as explicitly quote-unquote gay sex, in a way of saying, look, these kinds of sexual relations are actually natural. They exist beyond the human species. Now, Alamo's critique, right, is that both of these are human appropriations of animal sex. It's a way of fixing, and her point, right, is that animals are animate beings, and because they are animate beings, they are always more than the linguistic representations or the categorical representations that humans give to them. And to be animate is to exceed fixing within these categories. Another way of thinking about this is what's the difference between a butterfly pinned to an entomologist's board, right, in a taxonomy, right, pinned to a board, killed and pinned to a board, alongside other insects as a representation of a type or a species. And what's the difference between that butterfly and the butterfly that flutters just beyond reach, right? That's a difference of animacy. To be animate is to always exceed these kinds of typological or categorical fixings. It's always to exceed the representations. It's to exist just beyond our reach. And the thing about being animate is that, for this reason, animate things challenge us. They challenge our categories. Being animate means challenging our categories, and our definitions that are given in advance. Because the world is always more than that. Now, this is a concept that I'm kind of elaborating a little bit because it really resonates powerfully with the theme of indeterminacy that comes up throughout Anat Singh's book, as well as Dave's work in the previous book on affect, on the importance of the body, on the importance of sensations and feelings that are always just beyond being fixed into norms. Or maybe not always just beyond, but that which is just beyond the cusp of being fixed into a norm. Now, if you want to kind of fuck around on the internet, I've given a link for this art project called Multi-Species Salon, which is a kind of anthropological art project thinking about human-non-human relations and imagining different kinds of bodies and relationships. I also just want to mention in this picture up at the top that I really love this picture of this boy sleeping with the cow, with the birdies, the crows, I guess, on this landscape, right? Because what I like about this picture is it raises this question, right? How do human and non-human beings live together within these landscapes that we share, that we transform together? Okay, so coming back to Anna Singh's book. Anna Singh is really helping us think through what life looks like after these dreams of progress that shape the colonial and capitalist project collapse and crumble around us. She's not thinking about life after capitalism per se, although she's interested in that too. She's interested in how life in the ruins of capitalism can help us think about life in the ruins after capitalism. But she is interested in this moment that is not a pure post-capitalist space or a pure post-colonial space, but still remains life as these dreams of progress, as these dreams of modernity crumble around us. And Anna Singh has this point. This is the second point in the PowerPoint. I hardly know how to think about justice without progress. What does justice mean without this idea of progressivism, for example, to go back to a word that Sean Jay critiques? What does justice mean if we're not seeking to progress to a better state of society? If we don't assume that this nature of society is to constantly progress in this line towards a more advanced, more just future? Now, you may have picked up on this, some of y'all who've taken the anthropology of theory or taken intro with me, which is that there's this complex tension between social evolutionist theory from the 1800s, this idea that human society naturally progresses from savage to barbarian to whatever the word I'm looking for, civilized, or from bands to chiefdoms to states. Bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states. This idea of this universal march of human progress with left-wing politics, with progressivism, which likewise imagines what MLK describes, for example, as the arc of justice. I hope I'm remembering that quote correctly, right? This kind of idea that history's arc always bends towards justice, towards greater progress, towards greater advancement. Now, it's complicated and uncomfortable to think about the ways in which these leftist ideologies resonate with these, what were at the time very liberal conceptions of the importance of empire and colonialism, justifications for colonialism. I say liberal because they supplanted earlier ideas that colonized peoples belong to a separate genesis in a biblical sense and were thus technically separate species. So it was a liberal intervention that continued to justify empire. Anyway, circling back around, I hardly know how to think about justice without this idea of progress. So how do we think about justice without progress? And Singh writes in this page 2, I find myself without the handrails of stories to tell where everyone is going to go, and also why. If we give up, if we're living in this space as dreams of progress and modernity crumble around us, we're left without handrails, the handrails of stories. And as she writes, such sensibilities for justice without progress, or other kinds of handrails, such sensibilities will be needed for the end of global progress's easy summer. The autumn aroma leads me into common life without guarantees. This book is not a critique of dreams of modernization and progress. As she says, other people have laid out those critiques very robustly. She's not going to reproduce those critiques. Instead, she's interested in the imaginative challenge of living without those handrails. So, building on these earlier critiques of modernization and progress, her goal is to really do that imaginative labor of life without the handrails of these colonial concepts of modernity, progress, rationality, these liberal presuppositions that Jacobson critiques critiqued in the very first thing we read this semester. Now, this should remind you a little bit of Dave's argument, right? How do we engage in that imaginative labor, that ethical work of opening spaces of potential worlds otherwise? Now, one of the handrails that Anat Singh does propose is this difference between what she describes as looking around versus looking ahead. That's just so poetic. I really love it. Whereas looking ahead is this kind of metaphor of progress. We're looking ahead to the future. Anat Singh says, no, what if we just looked around instead? How do we fine-tune the way, what she calls our arts of noticing? How do we attune our attention, our ability to notice what kinds of possibilities already take shape within the post-apocalyptic landscapes that we already inhabit? This takes me to the first concept in Anat Singh's work, the concept of precarity. She defines this concept neatly on page 20, although it also comes up in the very first few pages of the book. Precarity is the condition of being vulnerable to others. Precarity is vulnerability. And she argues that we're always being transformed by these unpredictable encounters we have with others. And because of that, we're not in control, even of ourselves. We often imagine that human beings are masterful subjects or masterful controllers of the world. But we're not. We don't have that level of control. We don't have that level of agency. We don't have that level of mastery. We don't even control ourselves to that extent because we are always being remade and transformed through our relationships with human and non-human beings around us. You are not the same person you were a year ago because you have been transformed by your relations. So thinking more about this concept of precarity, right? What some of the specific things that Singh means, right, is that precarity, within a state of precarity, no one has a regular job. We're still dependent on capitalism, but we don't have full-time jobs. We don't have benefits. Sometimes we don't even make wages. So as an example of that kind of precarity, here is, a delivery person thinking about an economy that's now built on things like Uber and DoorDash, right? These kinds of contingent, precarious forms of labor. I am literally, because I'm an adjunct professor, I have a part-time position where I devote far more than 40 hours a week teaching students and doing research, for a little over $200,000 a year without health care and no job security. My contract is semester to semester. That's precarious labor, right? It's labor without security. These kinds of labor are characteristic of what Singh calls the failure of these dreams of modernity. Now, modernity means, in this context, this failure is both on the part of capitalism, but also communism. Communism also failed us. Because, as Singh points out, both capitalism and communism are these dreams for a progressive, better, more just, a future that is justice in the sense of progress. These are, another scholar, Donna Haraway, says, Donna Haraway calls this, calls them salvation narratives. The idea that humans will be salvaged, we will find salvation in a communist utopia or in capitalist progress. And as Anat Singh, like Donna Haraway, argues, that's not happening. We're seeing these dreams collapse around us, and we're left to make life in ruins. We're left to make life in landscapes shaped by the disasters and ruination of these progressive dreams. Now, apparently I said I make $200,000 a year. I fucking wish. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant $20,000 a year. I don't know if some of y'all probably make more money than I do. And this is common, I'm not saying this to be like, woe is me. I mean, I am, because you should be aware of the injustices that structure your own education. But this is, a condition of academic labor. Is overwhelmingly labor is being moved from secure employment as tenure-track professors to the precarious labor of adjuncts who are given a semester-by-semester contract teaching select numbers of courses without benefits. This is a situation that has been radically exacerbated by the pandemic. Agnes Scott actually was supposed to offer me full-time benefited employment, but then the fucking economy collapsed. Which also reminds me of a point that Anna Singh brings up early in the book. And I love this little quote that is aged so well. So well. Anna Singh writes, hold on, let me find it. Anna Singh writes, because we're living in these spaces of environmental collapse and economic collapse, right? The economy is no longer a source of growth or optimism. Any of our jobs could disappear in the next economic crisis. And hey, that just happened. Anna Singh was right. Now, the last piece in this slide, right, is this quote, precarity once seemed the fate of the less fortunate. Now it seems that all of our lives are precarious. I think I mentioned this last class, right? This idea that apocalyptic climate devastation was once seen to be an issue facing only the most marginalized peoples in the world. But what we're finding is that those who thought themselves secure are finding themselves to be also precarious. And so Singh's argument here, right, is that precarity is not just an issue facing the most marginalized peoples in the world. It's actually a defining feature of capitalism in the 21st century. A precarious world is a world without teleology. Teleology means the ways in which teleology is a logical flaw in which things are justified by where they're going, or it's assumed it's a flaw in historical analysis, right? We assume that the purpose of these historical events is to get to where we were now. When, people don't act that way. So, social evolutionism is a teleology. It assumes that civilization, quote unquote, civilization is the endpoint towards which all societies are heading. That the state of Europe was the endpoint, and all other societies were somehow broken or somewhere previously along that trajectory. It's a logical flaw. It's a teleological flaw in that it assumes that everyone is heading to the same direction, which is progress. And instead of teleology, Singh introduces this concept of indeterminacy, instability, things not being determined or fixed, but rather radically open and unplanned and precarious. Indeterminacy, or the unplanned nature of time, is frightening, but thinking through precarity makes it evident that indeterminacy also makes life possible. So for Singh, right, indeterminacy is scary. Not having that security can be scary. It can be frightening. The unplanned nature of time can be frightening. The unknown nature of the future can be frightening. And yet, it's also that open-endedness, that indeterminacy that makes life possible. So for Singh, indeterminacy is not an inherently bad thing. It's a condition of life. Now, when we talk about, coming back to the subject of the book, Matsuyataki picking, this is precarious labor. It's not a regular job. It's unwaged, it's unsalaried, it's unbenefited. People go into the forest and they pick mushrooms and they sell them, and these mushrooms enter into these global markets and flows. But the people who pick them are paid based on the volume of what they pick. They are precarious labor. Some years they may find no mushrooms and they will make no money and are left with only their expenses. Some years the market might collapse. So for Singh, Matsuyataki harvesting is an entry point into this state of 21st century capitalism as an economy of precarity. It is part of this larger process. So too does this particular economic field, or industry, for lack of a better word, provide us an entry point into thinking about capitalism as a system of ruination. Now, Tsink's point here is that capitalism is a process of producing ruins. She's drawing on a scholar, Walter Benjamin, who is a philosopher who ended up committing suicide in the advance of the Nazi Germany. It's actually a really tragic story that I can't remember the details of. Like, I think he might have committed suicide just days before the defeat of Nazi Germany or something like that. Anyway, Walter Benjamin has this argument that the nature of capitalism is to produce ruins. The idea is that capitalism is premised on this idea of progress, this idea of producing that which is new and more advanced. We can think of this like planned obsolescence. Capitalism thrives by producing new phones, right, that are fancier and fancier. Meanwhile, the phones from 2 years ago are built to be broken down and break and fall apart. Not literally fall apart, but stop working, break. They are planned. There's a planned part of the system that you will have to continuously buy newer and newer in phones, which means that part of what capitalism needs to do in order to fuel growth is to produce waste, produce ruin, in order to continue producing the present as existing on the edge of the future, as a kind of breaking apart from a pre-modern or backwards past. In order to always be approaching that new future, the past always has to be being produced as ruins. Now, Walter Benjamin's example is he writes about arcades in France. Arcades are not what arcades mean in the 1980s to today, but when Walter Benjamin was writing, an arcade was basically a mall. And actually, maybe I should talk about malls instead of arcades. The idea was an arcade was a set of buildings in which the newest set of buildings built around the end of the 1800s. And within arcades, were these display cases, essentially, right, where the newest, fanciest products of capitalist production were put on display. And through this process of display, they came to have what Benjamin calls an aura of progress, of futurity. They were fancy and shiny and new. And that cultural construction, that cultural sensibility of newness and shininess was created through this process of displaying them. Even things like shining, the way the light was set up in these buildings. Now, the problem was that by the time Walter Benjamin was writing in the early 1900s was that these arcades, these buildings, were no longer cutting edge. They were abandoned spaces that were falling into ruin. And they create this kind of tension, right, for Benjamin, between these spaces that were supposed to be shiny and new that are now falling into ruin. And isn't that the nature of capitalism, Benjamin writes, to produce the shiny and new and let that shiny and new fall into these uncanny systems of ruin? We can think about contemporary malls, or not contemporary, but 1990s to early 2000 era malls being very similar. Malls were once thriving places of businesses and consumption, surrounded by the same kind of aura of consumption, this aura, bright, shiny lights, high technology, cutting-edge fashion, right? And yet, in the last 15 to 20 years, we see the decline of malls, and now malls are overwhelmingly hollowed out with empty storefronts. Some malls are totally abandoned and are falling apart and are being consumed by plant growth that, whatever the word I'm looking for, moves forward into these spaces of ruin. And this is all sets of examples that capitalism is a production of ruins. Ruins are not antithetical to capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system that relies on systematically producing spaces of ruin. So Singh writes, when the singular asset can no longer be produced, this place is abandoned. The timber has been cut, the oil is run out, the plantation soil no longer supports crops. The search for assets must resume elsewhere. Once you've extracted all the resources of a place, all capitalism can do is move to another place and extract those resources and let those places fall into ruin. And this creates this cycle of what Singh calls modernity and ruin, or extraction and ruin. And so this is when Agnes Singh talks about Matsuazaki forests, these are spaces produced by ruins. These are spaces produced as timber companies cut down old growth forests and new species of tree took root and spread into these spaces, and the forests changed. And essentially, the logging companies eventually moved out because there was no longer any valuable wood to cut down. There's this constant production because there's this search for the singular asset, the specific species of pine. Once that has been cut down, the place is abandoned. The timber has been cut. The search for assets must resume elsewhere. However, as Singh writes, ruins are also spaces that yield new multi-species and multicultural life within a global state of precarity. These forests are both the ruins of capitalist production. These forests in Oregon are the ruins produced by capitalist production, but they also are spaces in which new forms of interspecies, multi-species collaborations are able to thrive. These networks of mushrooms and new species of trees, firs, and other species of pines. And humans that migrate from across the world as a result of these global processes of warfare and conflict and capitalist exploitation in order to make life together in these spaces of capitalist ruins. So this is Singh's project, right? Looking for disturbance-based ecologies in which many species sometimes live together without either harmony or conquest. This is not a utopian narrative. It is not a salvation narrative. It's a narrative about how to make life within disturbance-based ecologies, living together without either harmony or conquest. This is what Singh calls contamination. To be contaminated, she writes, we are contaminated by our encounters. They change who we are, and as we make way for others. So contamination is the state of life. Contamination is basically the effect of being transformed by our encounters with other people. This runs counter to the assumption of self-contained individuals, right? We are not self-contained beings. We are constantly being remade through our encounters with others. What this means, right, is that this is part of what Agnes Singh means, right? She's not seeking a space beyond capitalism or liberated from capitalism. She's not seeking a space of salvation. She's seeking contaminated life or contaminated diversity. Ways of being within spaces contaminated by capitalist systems of ruin. And she's seeking ways of life in which we can be contaminated by one another. And this is counter to these, again, liberal presuppositions of the self-contained individual. And as Singh would argue, this idea, this liberal supposition of the self-contained individual is itself is part of the system that creates these systems of ruin and system of precarity. And it's interesting, right, that these systems of ruination and these systems of precarity, these systems of liberal governance, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. And these seeds coexist, right? It's not that they're supplanted. It's just that both things are existing together. The systems of ruin and the seeds of their otherwise. Now, Singh also has this point, units are the effects of encounters, not the other way around. What this means, right, is that when she talks about contamination, there are no units that can be taken and advanced. There is no forest that exists prior to contamination. There are no ethnic groups that exist prior to contamination. Rather, things like forests and ethnic identities emerge through the process of contamination. The forests in Oregon are already products of complex indigenous systems of forestry and land management that include regulated burning, that produced particular kinds of multi-species ways of life. Those particular ecologies proved exceptionally valuable for capitalist exploitation, which then clear-cut this species of pine. And I'm going to come back to that later, right? The forest is always a space of contamination. Likewise, with ethnic identity, there are no ethnic groups that exist as units prior to the process of contamination, to the process of history. Rather, ethnic identity is something that emerges through these complex networks of war and immigration and labor. As Agnes Scott says, staying alive requires livable collaborations. Staying alive requires contamination. And so if precarity is an acknowledgement of our vulnerability, we always need help in order to survive. I'm going to come back to that because Agnes Scott has a really lovely example of that. But living is always a collaborative effort. We never live by ourselves alone. We always exist together. We're always making life together with human and non-human beings. Now, these forests in Oregon are examples of what Singh calls contaminated diversity. I love this concept. Matsutake thrives in relationship to this particular species of pine. But let me go back further. I said earlier that forests in Oregon in the 1800s were shaped by indigenous forestry practices. They were specific ecologies that were maintained through these human and non-human relationships that proved exceptionally valuable within these emerging capitalist systems. As a result, these forests, let me find the exact, I'm sorry, I need to find the species in my notes because I get these multiple species of pine mixed up sometimes. So part of what happens as a result of these indigenous forestry practices is the emergence of ponderosa pine forests. And these ponderosa pines are especially valuable within this capitalist system for a variety of purposes. So loggers cut down the ponderosa pines. Meanwhile, forestry and conservation specialists or loggers and foresters within the United States are usually in conflict in this era, but they could agree on one thing, which was the importance of suppressing wildfires. And so this comes to shape policy in the U.S., this policy of fire suppression. The problem, though, is that ponderosa pines couldn't reproduce without those fires. And so what happens instead is the forest changes. This leads to expansions of fir and lodgepole pines, which create a dense and highly flammable underbrush. And so there's this complicated tension where on the one hand, these processes of capitalist exploitation of forests and state management of forests ends up transforming the very spaces they're meant to exploit and also conserve. And it in fact creates the conditions, these highly flammable conditions, that then exacerbate the problems that they're trying to avoid, which is wildfires. Hence, we have issues today where, for example, California is regularly on fire. This is, again, thinking about climate change as a colonial ecology. But we also find these new ecologies that thrive in spaces of human disturbance, these ecologies of fir and lodgepole. So too does Matsutake flourish in these ruined landscapes. This particular species of mushroom does really well living in the root systems or at the base of lodgepole pines. And because the lodgepole pines thrive due to fire suppression, so too do Matsutake mushrooms. And they have this really mutually beneficial relationship where each provides nutrients for the other within the context of nutrient-poor soils. So these mushrooms are actually helping the pines survive within these landscapes of ruins, just as the trees are helping the mushrooms survive. This is contaminated diversity. This is life within these spaces of capitalist ruins. But humans are also still a part of this, right? Because you have migrations of military vets, and especially military people from Southeast Asia during the Indo-Chinese Wars who fought on the side of the United States, especially in anti-communist Cold War struggles. And as a result of these complex histories, right, we see these complex histories in which peoples are constantly moving, are nomadic in order to avoid the consolidation of state power in, for example, bureaucracies such as the Chinese government. We see the enrollment of peoples in military struggles against communists in this kind of Cold War dynamic between the U.S. and Russia that's fought in the theater of Southeast Asia. And following the Indo-Chinese Wars and following these Cold War struggles, many of them end up migrating to the United States in the 1980s through government programs that brought anti-communist forces from this region into the United States as refugees. However, in this moment, just as these migrants are being brought into the United States as refugees, so too is the federal government cutting all of these forms of welfare, all of these welfare programs, which means that these new migrants, these new immigrants, are not in a situation where they are being given resources to make life in these new spaces. And so many of them move to forests where they start gathering Matsuotake mushrooms, using these survival skills they developed in the Indo-Chinese Wars. However, in these forests, in these spaces that are really on the edges of capitalism, again, this is not wage labor. It's not outside of capitalism, but it's also not wage labor. It's a different form of exploitation that is defined by precarity. Within this context, right, we don't see people forming shared ethnic identities. We don't see the formation of a Southeastern Asian identity or even American identity. We rather see the reproduction of a spatial politics in which communities are keeping camps separately. So we have Maine, Hmong, Lao, and Khmer camps that are kept separate. Now, as a result of these processes, we have the emergence of what we would call ethnic identities. Whereas before, ethnicity was not the unit of analysis, right? Keeping in mind Singh's point that units of analysis are the effects of encounters, not the conditions. We see the emergence of people who become ethnicities through this process of migrating away from the centers of power, such as Chinese bureaucracy, through enrollment in anti-communist programs organized by the United States, through programs of immigration to the United States, and through the spatial politics of foraging camps within these contaminated forests. And so we see this entire set of ethnic formations and labor formations that are all functions of contaminated diversity. It's not diversity in the sense of all of these parties that existed prior to the capitalist ruination finding ways of existing together. It is finding ways of existing. It is a diversity that emerges through these processes of contamination. Now this brings us to Singh's concept of scalability versus non-scalability. For Singh, scalability is the ability of a project to change scale smoothly. So she gives an example in a different paper of pixelation, right? When you pixelate, you can zoom in and out, and the picture does not change when you zoom in or out, when you scale in or scale out. The reason is because the digital image is a function of pixels, of isolated, discrete, homogeneous units. And when you scale in or out, the relationships between those units don't change. This is the opposite of contamination, right? The units aren't transformed through their relations, through their processes. The pieces aren't transformed. And so scalability is only possible if relations are not transformed by their relations. Or, as she puts it in a different way, scalability demands elements or units that are oblivious to the indeterminacies of encounter. These scalable units are not vulnerable. They are not open to change by their relations to others. So when we think of, for example, scalability as a different example, we can scale the concept of scalability into the next example, the business. When a business is meant to scale up, the idea is that a project should grow, but the essential form of the project shouldn't change, meaning the project should grow up, but the elements aren't supposed to transform. We can also think of this as nonprofit work. When we think of nonprofit work, a common critique in anthropology of international development is that as these systems move from location to location, international NGOs often fail to engage with the local specificities of place. For example, an NGO might build a water pump, which provides people with water, which helps them flourish better, not have to worry about dehydration. But maybe the water pump breaks. Did the NGO consider, is that community going to be able to get replacement parts? And so now there's a broken pump that can't be fixed. There's actually an extended example, let's see if I can do this quickly, of water temples in Bali, where in the 1960s and 70s, international NGOs wanted to make Balinese farming more productive, to produce higher yields. This was part of a global project meant to eradicate world hunger. Very noble goals, right? And so they introduced things like genetically modified plants, what were considered scientific farming techniques, basically in order to increase productivity. But they didn't pay attention to the local environment. And the subtext, right, was that Balinese farming was governed by water temples, which were not just places of prayer, but also places where farmers would gather together in order to democratically participate in the farming process. And they would make decisions like, how should water be diverted down the mountain? Who should cultivate which fields, and which fields get water first, which fields get water second. And it was this whole elaborate system, basically, of moving water down the mountain through these fields, in a very controlled way. And one of the things that happened, that farmers did, is they would cultivate a bunch of fields at once, and then let everything lie fallow, and then cultivate the next set of fields further down the mountain. What this did is it made it very hard for pests to adapt, because by the time the pests laid eggs and those eggs hatched, the fields had been harvested, and there wasn't any more fields available. Now, when these international NGOs tried to introduce these international standards of farming, they assumed they knew best, and they eliminated that cycling crop process. And essentially what happened is pests overrun the crops, and the result was mass famine. This is a scalable project, right? How do we take what we know about farming in one location and scale it up so that it's an international project, or scale it to this new context? And the assumption of a scalable project is that the local relations and the transformations of these relations don't matter. Or rather, that the shifting of the project from place to place, or the scaling of it up, won't change the underlying dynamics. That the project will hold true without being transformed from place to place. This is a fundamental assumption of both liberal governance and capitalism, the ability of projects to be scaled. This leads to what Agnes Scott calls for as a theory of non-scalability. A theory of non-scalability, on the one hand, calls for the work it takes to make a project scalable. She says that elements are not, world systems and ecologies are not inherently scalable, right? It takes work to make them scalable. It takes work to create a system in which the parts can move around or be moved from place to place without transforming them. It takes work to create parts that are not transformed by their encounters with others. And as a result of this work, these scalable projects create messes. So this non-scalability theory accounts for both that work and the messes that scalability makes. It also accounts for the things that are non-scalable, relations that are in fact transformative. This brings us back to Matsuyataki production and this contrast that Singh draws between sugar plantations and Matsuyataki forests. Sugar plantations are scalable projects. There was a uniform set of procedures. Eliminate indigenous peoples through genocide or displacement. Eliminate local non-human diversity, especially plant diversity. Introduce a monocropped field introduce a new cultigen, and specifically a monocropped cultigen. In this case, we're talking about sugar, which, because Europeans at the time did not know how to breed sugar, were literally cloned sugar plants. So an entire field, entire islands, entire regions of clones. And introduce imported enslaved labor in order to cultivate those fields. And so this is a scalable system. It's about producing mass amounts of sugar. It's about having a social form or a project that can be identical whether it's happening in the U.S. South or Jamaica or anywhere else. This is very different than Matsuyataki forests, right? In which scientists have not been able to figure out how to cultivate Matsuyataki mushrooms. It just no one's been able to figure out how to do it. So you can't monocrop them. You can't scale up the project. All you can do is find the places where they're growing anyway, which is part of what makes these economies unamenable to these logics of scalability. It makes it not amenable to the logics of wage labor because you can't monocrop them. So instead, the economic system that emerges is this precarious piecemeal work of having contingent laborers who move through forests seeking out mushrooms to sell. This is a non-scalable project, even as it is also contingent on capitalism. And so this is the contradiction of, Matsuyataki production. It cannot be scaled up, yet it's also contingent upon the spaces of ruin produced by these scalable projects. The logging interests, for example. Anything from the way the forest is produced through this history of logging and indigenous genocide, to the histories of the pickers, which are dependent on these global wars and struggles between over state power and communism and capitalism. We're talking about life worlds that are emergent within the messes made by scalable projects, from global war to empire to forests in Oregon. So that's the basic argument of the book, right? Is we're looking at Matsuyataki forest picking as something that's contained within capitalist systems, and it's made possible by capitalist systems, and yet it is not amenable to these kinds of logics of of capitalist production, of mass production, of wage labor, of scalability. And so what we see is a whole set of social systems that gives us insight into precarity within contexts of environmental and economic catastrophe. It gives us insight into ruination as a function of capitalism. It gives us insight into, and it gives us insight into, an economic system as a way of making life within capitalist ruins that is both outside, yet not fully assimilable within these projects of war and capitalist production and plantation economies and empire. These next four concepts are a bit smaller, in the sense that they're useful. They help us deepen our understanding of this core argument, but they are not the core argument in the same way. There's what Singh calls patchiness. Patchiness is a mosaic of open-ended assemblages or entangled ways of life, with each further opening into a mosaic of temporal rhythms and spatial arcs. I argue that only an appreciation of current precarity as an earth-wide condition allows us to notice this, the situation of our world. As long as authoritative analysis requires assumption of growth, experts don't see the heterogeneity of space and time. So what Singh is trying to get at with patchiness is this heterogeneity of space and time. Instead of thinking about this universal system of growth or progress, right? Capitalism, colonialism, these ideologies of growth and progress. We instead see the heterogeneity of space and time. We see the messiness. We see the multiplicity. We see non-scalable systems. And part of Singh's argument here is that capitalism is also patchy. There is no unified system here. There is no unified march. Instead, what we have is these moments where value can be concentrated because of value produced in unplanned patches and the ways in which those unplanned patches are appropriated for capital. So this is, for example, to bring it back to the mushroom harvesting, we're looking at the ways in which there are global economic networks that do extract and concentrate value. Again, these are highly valuable mushrooms, especially in Japan. But the ways in which these capitalist systems are able to extract value is through non-capitalist processes, through these unplanned patches of contaminated diversity or contaminated forests, and the ways in which the value that emerges within these unplanned patches can be appropriated. How do we get something like Matsuatake mushrooms that are not amenable to scalability, and how can capital appropriate that value? That's what the book is about, right? It's about capitalism as a complex, messy, patchy heterogeneity process. There's this concept of world-making and assemblages. World-making is the everyday activity of making life, and how this activity alters the planets. So there's two sides there, right? There's world-making as an activity of making life, and then how this activity alters the landscape. We are always, according to this framework, engaged in this process of world-making. The world doesn't simply exist, but it's constantly being brought into being and transformed through our activity of existing. And both humans and non-humans are always participating in world-making projects. We're always remaking the world through we exist. Again, we could look at the history of the forest in Oregon, this process through which Matsuatake and these other species of pine that I've already forgotten the name of are able to cohabitate with each other and engage in and expand their ecologies and recreate forests and transform forests in this process of world making. The world is always coming into being. It's always becoming. It never just is. Tied to this is the concept of assemblages. Singh defines an assemblage as an open-ended gathering. This is a critique of earlier environmentalist frameworks that would talk about ecological communities. And instead of looking at a community, which is a kind of singular, unified thing, Singh is interested in how various species and actors influence one another, the ways they thwart each other as well as work together. Or maybe they just happen to find themselves in the same place. So again, just like with the idea of patchiness, Singh is trying to point us towards ways of life that don't exist in harmony, that don't exist in a kind of unified march together. but rather are the result of these accumulated things and forces that are always at odds and ends and working against as well as working with each other. Now, Singh does argue, right, that for her, the building blocks are not organisms, but historically specific lifeways, including non-living ways of being. This is basically the point again, right? Singh is not interested in units as a given. Rather, she's interested in the way that units emerge through this process of contamination. So the building blocks of an assemblage are lifeways and non-living ways of being, as Singh argues. And ways of being are emergent effects of encounters. They don't pre-exist the encounter, they emerge through encounter. Matsuotaki harvesting ways of being, these interrelationships between trees and plants and people, they're an emergent effect of these complex encounters. They don't just exist out in a pristine wilderness. They take shape through this process of contamination and ruination and becoming and transformation. The last piece is this concept of polyphony, or polyphonous music. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. This is yet another way Agnes Singh is basically really trying to beat us over the head with this point, right? Don't try and think about a unified march. Don't think about unity. Don't think about harmony. Don't think about everything working towards progress together. Instead, let's think about the heterogeneity of what's happening here. Let's think about diversity. And, for Singh, diversity, in an ecological sense, is necessary for life. Heterogeneity is necessary for life to exist, even as there are these processes of capitalism and scalability that are seeking to build hegemonity, whatever that word is, for the sake of profit, right? Monocropping, as an example of that. So what is polyphonous music? It's a style of music in which there is no unified rhythm or melody. It's rather all of these autonomous melodies that intertwine. There's no coordination of time in a polyphonous melody. There's rather multiplicity. We're used to hearing music with a single perspective. When I first learned of polyphony, whatever that word is, it was a revelation in listening. I was forced to pick out separate, simultaneous melodies and listen for the moments of harmony and dissonance that they created together. This kind of noticing is just what is needed to appreciate the multiple temporal rhythms and trajectories of the assemblage. It's about multiplicity. It's about tension as well as moments of working together or harmony. It's about heterogeneity. So Singh asks, through this concept of polyphony, how do we notice the gathering of multiple rhythms and temporalities that make up an assemblage? How do we pay attention? How do we attend to that multiplicity, those multiple rhythms? Now, I've given y'all some links. Go ahead and spend some time on YouTube listening to polyphonous music, because it's actually really interesting. Just fuck around on YouTube for a bit if you want. And so through these 8 concepts, Agnes Singh is giving us, on the one hand, an argument about mushroom picking as something that gives us insight into the state of the world, as a kind of practice of making life within spaces of ruin, within spaces of precarity, within these kinds of systems that are both inside and outside of capitalism at the same time. These spaces that are produced by capitalism and yet are not reducible to these processes of scalability. And she also gives us tools for thinking about heterogeneity and not just a unified march. Really, this is a critique. Again, these are ways of thinking of alternatives to the progress narrative. This idea of unity, again, a unified march. And instead, how do we cultivate what she calls an art of noticing that foregrounds? How do we notice heterogeneity around us? How do we notice that polyphony or patchiness, that multiplicity of an assemblage? This is what Agnes Singh calls an art. This is the main argument, right, of the book as cultivating an art of noticing and a way of imagining alternatives, or imagining what it would mean to live, what it means to live in ruins, by looking at life in post-apocalyptic landscapes as an ethnographic project. And she has a whole framework. She says her method is a rush of stories. I love that metaphor of a rush. It's just gonna be a bunch of stories, and that's the method. The research object is contaminated diversity. That's the thing that she's trying to understand. And the unit of analysis is the indeterminate encounter. It's not the individual. It's not the human. It's not, capitalism. It's the indeterminate encounter. It's the unpredictable and unplanned encounter between two beings, or between multiple beings, that transform one another. This is basically Anna Tsing's work. This whole framework is Anna Tsing trying to give us those handrails she pointed to from the beginning of the book. If her problem is there are no handrails for thinking about life outside of progress, or justice outside of progress, these are her handrails. These concepts give us the handrail. Now go forth and discuss on the discussion board. If you have something you want to talk about, as always, go for it, even if it's not on my 4 questions. But if you want some more structure, here are some questions to think through. I saw a lot of resonance between Tsing's work and both Dave's book and Sanjay's book, and I think that would be really interesting to talk about as well. Alright, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday.